Okay, and website's now being live streamed, so I'll click start webinar now. Okay.
Good evening, comrades. Thank you for joining us for another session of Why Marx. We're taking another look at the Social Democratic Party in Germany, SPD. We've just had a little discussion about that, how it's SPD. And last week, we took a look with Andrew Bonnell at how it became such a mass working class party. And he described, hundreds of newspapers, cycle clubs, walking clubs, political clubs, of course, education. They were really into the working class, on the roots of the working class, and it became a massive organization, the first working class party in history that had 1 million members. It's actually half today, but that's over 100 years ago, and 130 years ago. Oh my God, yes, time flies. And it's changed quite a lot in the process. But we want to have a look today specifically about how that working class mass party then also influenced the Bolsheviks and the Russian Revolution. With us to discuss this tonight is Lars T Lih, who's written a lot about the subject. Thank you very much for joining us. He'll be speaking for about 45 minutes, and then we're opening up for questions and comments from the floor. Hi, Lars, over to you.
Okay, good. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the Bolsheviks and the SPD model, and the Russians themselves are not going to show up until about halfway through, I imagine. But in one sense, I'm talking about them from the beginning, because I'm going to talk about how they saw Marx and how they saw the SPD. So I'm going to be going over sort of a move from Marx, basic principles of Marx, to how the SPD model could be seen as an embodiment of precisely those principles, and then we'll get finally into the how the Russians could or could not try to apply this model in Russia under their peculiar circumstances and the long-term influence. And sort of hovering over my talk will be the merger formula, as I called it in one of my books, which is social democracy is the merger of socialism and the worker movement. And since this is about fusion, I guess that the merger formula is appropriate, although it's not pointing to the same thing. Okay, so as I say, I am going to be talking about Marx basic principles, but I say once more that this is sort of how the Russians look at it. In some sense, I learned it from them. Okay, so the thing about Marx is not that he was a socialist. There are plenty of socialists around at the time and later. It was the idea of who was going to bring socialism, and that was going to be the working class for it. So the essential part of Marxism then is it's a historical mission of the working class, that they have the ones to bring this about. To what socialism is was not his first and foremost concern. It was the idea that that there would be the working class who would bring it, and so how that's going to happen, it was, although he didn't formulate it exactly like this, but it sums up his logic. That on the one hand you have the merger of socialism movement, which is that the socialists at the time were famously going around looking for reformers or millionaires, or just sort of the last person they thought they would actually achieve socialism with the working class, who were downtrodden and exploited and not going to be the people able to do it. And then the worker movement, which was militant and organized and ready to fight, but didn't have a clear idea of its goal. So ultimate. So the idea is that Marx and Engels had this idea that what you want is for this merger to take place, and where the worker movement would understand that socialism expresses its deepest interests, and the socialists would understand that the working class is the only agent that could possibly bring about socialism in the real world. So if you have the omission of a historical mission, the first thing you need is to get the working class ready for its mission. As I think Kautsky said one time, in the mission of us social democrats in the 1890s is our mission is to prepare the working class for their mission. And so the two key terms are enlightenment and organization. Those are the two things that you need if you're going to get the working class ready to fulfill its mission. And you'll find that that formulation, enlightenment and organization, in various different wordings and places. But that's the basic idea. So as we go through the rest of this talk, we'll see those two things are what people were struggling to do. And another deduction from these basic principles was what I call the manifesto tactic of the communists have a final goal which is permanent. So keep your eye on the prize. You don't give up halfway. You don't accept this. You don't accept that. You want the final prize, which is reconstruction of society on socialist terms. But there are plenty of things you need to do that. The tasks that you need to get done. One of the biggest ones for Marx, for all of these people, is political freedom, because that's what we just said, enlightenment and organization. You need political freedom to do that on a mass scale. And in Europe at the time, there wasn't a lot of it. So the first thing on your agenda was to fight for political freedom. But there are a lot of people who are fighting for political freedom who aren't your socialists. So you go with them for a while, but they stop at the way station. This is Engels' metaphor. There's way stations on the path to socialism, and this person or that person will drop out because they got what they wanted, political freedom. That's all they want if they're a democratic Republican or something. But you, the socialists, should keep on going all the way to the end. Okay, so that's basic principles. Now, how do you bring that stuff into the real world? And here we go to Ferdinand Lassalle, who I think is sort of unduly forgotten. I tried to bring him back in my first big book on Lenin. But I just want to say what his ideas were about bringing it to the real world, and he operationalized these ideas. And there are three things that he did that I would insist on. One is that he had the idea of the sense of mission. So he took these principles from Marx and Engels, and he kind of vulgarized them in some ways and misunderstood in other ways. But on the essentials, he was bringing these principles into the real world. And one was to have the sense of mission, what he called the fourth estate. But he said, workers, you have a great responsibility. Let's do it. So the sort of inspiring rhetoric of a mission was what Lassalle put into mass terms. The next thing was the invention of the permanent campaign. And you probably got a good idea what this was from last week's talk. But if you read Lassalle's thing, he said that we want agitators to go onto these things every day, knock on doors and have slogans and have campaigns. And so this idea of a party that was sort of built around a permanent campaign, essentially, was really his idea, very important idea. And then finally, the third thing I would say is that he founded a party and got it going. So that's put it into the real world. What eventually became, after much complicated background, the German Social Democratic Party. Okay, so that's what I consider the basic principles of the Marx that leading behind the model and how the Russians saw it. So I want to take just a quick look at what the SPD looked like to Russians standing there. So the Russians are under autocracy. The industry is only getting started, so forth. But they look west, and what do they see in this in their neighboring country? And I'm going to be rapid here because I think you know mostly what I'm going to say from last week's and in general. So they saw the SPD as an embodiment of Marx's basic idea, and so it was a party whose mission was to prepare the working class for its mission. It lived by the merger formula, that is, it was trying to bring socialist doctrines to the workers and trying to get the intellectual socialists on board for helping the workers. It was both mass and radical. So that was an accomplishment at the time. There were sort of mass parties and there were radical parties, sort of people sitting around in cafes, but a mass radical party. It was very impressive. And then all the press campaigns and this comes from the logic of the permanent campaign. All the time spreading the message, or Kautsky once said, spreading the good news, and rallies. If you read autobiographical memoirs of social democratic praktiki, the activists in Russia, 1890, talking about their early years, 1890s and so forth. They sort of, there's always a part where they go to Vienna or they go to Berlin or somewhere and they just say, wow, look at this, a huge rally with thousands of people out in the open, and the fiery agitator doing it. So they just love to do that in Russia, but couldn't for it. It was growing influence. It was, it looked like it was on the move. It was getting bigger, more influential. It was the title of a famous and very classic analysis is The Alternative Culture, and that's all these sporting clubs and fishing clubs and choirs and chess clubs and whatever. It had an effective organization, national organization with Congress, where two things are striking, and we're much impressed the Russians, is sort of Congress's elaborate procedures for genuine democratic attempt to keep both forge a collective opinion, but keep it democratic, and also it's a professional bureaucracy, which in the long run may have proved a problem, but it's very impressive, and behind the idea, which is later, of the professional revolutionary. So that was one thing, was that they had a national organization that looked very effective. And finally, they were champions of political freedom in Germany and elsewhere. And again, Kautsky, they were more Democrats than the Democrats. Because why? Because according to the logic of the Marx thing, you need political freedom to get to your final goal. So it's not, political freedom is not your final goal, but it's an absolutely necessary means to get to your final goal, which means that the socialists were very often more committed to getting political freedom than the people who put political freedom directly on their banner. Okay, so that's again the model. Now I'm going to go see how the Russians were doing about it. So what's the I want to preface this with the role of Karl Kautsky. So okay, I gather that that some of what I say about Kautsky is controversial, and people call me what's the word, neo-Kautskyan and so forth. What I'm about to say is not really involved with that. This is less controversial, more basic, it's earlier. So I hope that prejudices or views of what I think about the later relationship will not interfere here. So here's an erudite comparison to Kautsky to Montesquieu. Why? Because the French revolutionaries of the 18th century looked to the British Parliament as a model, and they got their idea of that through Montesquieu, who provided a sort of an idealized version of it. And so there was that idealized version rather than the messy reality, that inspired the French revolutionaries, or at least the generation previous. And same with Kautsky. He was the Russians' guide to what the SPD was all about. And so he, Lenin and all the Russians were first, especially Lenin, Kautsky's book, the Air Force Program, and especially the final chapter of that book, which I hope someday, there is a translation, but it's not very good. So from 1900 or whatever. And so that's a basic sort of textbook for everybody in Russia as to what social democracy was. It wasn't sort of even advocating, he was just defining it. So what's the basic, when the first thing you notice when you're saying, oh, social democratic model looks good, what about it, is that it depends on political freedom. It depends on public mass organization. You've got to be able to publish a paper without being arrested. You have rallies, political parties have to be legal. So, so how do you deal with that fact? Say we're now in the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s. And I'm going to, the parable of there are two ways of thinking about it. Now, the parable of the two Ulyanov brothers, Sasha and Volodya. Sasha Ulyanov said, okay, the social democratic model is great, but we can't apply it here. We have no political freedom. It's a police state. So the only way to get to the point where we can apply the social democratic model is to use terroristic non-SPD methods, terroristic assassination of the czar, knock it off at the top, open it up, and bring on a sort of a democratic republic that way, and then you can move from there. And they did assassinate one czar, and Sasha Ulyanov tried to do that again and was caught and executed. So that was a big failure. So his younger brother, Volodya Ulyanov, said, okay, we're going to try another way of doing this. I agree with my big brother that we get to the place where we can apply the SPD model. That's our goal to do that, but we'll do it by applying the SPD model as much as possible under the circumstances, under the repressive police state, czarist autocracy. So I'm going to sort of sum up the Volodya Ulyanov strategy, and not just him, of course, but other people, is let's apply the SPD model as much as possible under czarist conditions in order to overthrow the czarist state, get political freedom so that we can apply the SPD model even more. Okay, so that's I may repeat that little summary because I think that's what was going on. So now I'm going to show how that line of thought. Okay, Volodya Ulyanov, known to history later as N. Lenin. Most of you probably know that already. So here's how the strategy worked out. And again, it's nothing coming out of anyone's particular head. It was a whole generation or so of people working, trying out this, trying out that. And if Lenin's contribution really was to sort of, he had his own ideas, but he was also listening and summarizing this experience. So, first of all, he felt that his generation, Lenin's generation, had something his brother's generation did not have, a genuine mass movement in the, not in the numbers that German had, but a mass base in the working class of people who were ready to respond, who were receptive to the message, were organized, were militant. And so the idea that comes from the Cold War that he was all pessimistic about the workers is trash. So that's the first thing. It's something like a mass movement. Secondly, what have I written here? There's something like a party press. I keep saying something like because it was all as he knew and emphasized, sort of a feeble imitation of the mighty Social Democratic press, but it was an underground paper. It had to be printed abroad and had to be smuggled in and had to be, but it was a national paper. The Scrab I'm talking about, the Spark. So they tried to say even under repressive conditions we can have something like a party press. We can have something like paid professionals who will maintain stability, organizational cadre, an organizational framework that will last more than they will be able to withstand the in very tough repression and arrests and so forth. That's the famous professional revolutionaries, which that term is, when you think of professional revolutionary, you think of some guy with a bomb sneaking into a building or something. But what he meant, Lenin, it's very as prosaic as possible. You sort of someone who could organize this, who could move around and make a national organization, make something like a real, genuinely national, not just a bunch of people here and a bunch of people there, and provide some continuity and some experience and so forth, and be a link between the locals and the central leadership. And by the way, the idea of the professional revolutionary was adopted by all the parties. Wasn't the Bolshevik thing. It wasn't even the socialist revolutionaries. Of course, they were professional revolutionists because if you had an underground organization, you had to have them. Okay, something like the party conferences and the party, sort of a collective decision making. And that's a kind of a feat. We read about the first Congress, second Congress, third Congress, but to have that sense of a national collective entity was very, very important. And when the time came for them to take power, they had two decades or more of experience in having a national organization like that. Okay, what have I got here? So yes, and then it's what the threads strategy, which that metaphor I take from a Bolshevik activist, a very useful source for this material. He was there, and konspiracja. Okay, so if you konspiracja means conspiracy in Russian, but it's not a conspiracy in our sense of the word, like a plot or anything. There's another word in Russian for that, zagovor. So konspiracja was sort of the rules of having. It's the opposite of a plot. It's trying to have a public movement that was not going to be arrested the next day. But the idea was to spread your message as much as possible, not to keep it to yourself, like in a zagovor, like the earlier generation of revolutionaries, Russian revolutionaries operated. And the threads idea was that you had your sort of roots in the working class, and we could do it here, do it there, and even if your organization was arrested, you could get back into it, and that you didn't have the public rallies, you couldn't sit in go to door with a petition, but you did have a genuine sense of a base in the working class, and they would help you. You couldn't do what you're trying to do without that base. And it was not just the professional revolution. It was not just even the most committed activists. It was a sort of wider and wider sphere of sympathizers and so forth. And finally, the thing about the underground version, we can call it, of the SPD was the primordial importance of political freedom. And if either, but my suggestion, I have a suggestion: read a book by Lenin that was published he published in 1903, if I remember correctly, called "To the Rural Poor." To the Rural Poor. So the title doesn't give you the idea of why it's an exciting book. It's a pamphlet, I should say. It's about, I don't know, 50, 60 pages. But you'll see that political freedom. What did the Social Democrats want? This is the title of one of his sections. They want political freedom. Why do they want political freedom? Because look at our neighboring Germany. Workers can fight for their rights. They can express their opinions. They can vote for people in parliament. That's what we want. So I think it's a sort of and Lenin very rarely sat down to express basic social democratic principles, because he figured the Germans, so Kautsky and other authors from that, were doing that good enough job. So political freedom, among other things, meant what allies you choose, and you go back to this idea that there are lots of other people who want political freedom in Russia for different reasons. You can ally with them, knowing that they're limited, but political freedom is very, very important for everybody, and it's most important for the workers, most important for the socialists, because they could apply the SPD model in that case. And the final thing on political freedom was that of the two factions in the Social Democratic Party, Bolsheviks and Mensheviks, it was the Bolsheviks who put that even more insistent on it. And the Mensheviks sometimes said, "Oh, the Bolsheviks are just Democrats that want political freedom," whereas the Mensheviks are more class-oriented. So we should keep that perception in mind. It's a little bit paradoxical from what happened later. Okay, so now I want to go to the SPD model, sort of after the revolution, as it were, after the Tsar fell, because we up to now we've been talking about applying the SPD model under underground conditions, under the conditions of a repressive, autocratic state. And so first of all, the famous principle of democratic centralism was actually, when they talked about it, it was often said, we often say that democratic centralism is a principle that comes from the underground conditions, but really closer to the reverse. They said we'd like to have democratic centralism, but we can't be too democratic under repressive conditions, because we can't have open party debates and everything. We can't have open party elections. So democratic centralism only really comes into play in the days of freedom, so-called. One was in 1905, and the other one was in 1917. And at other times, either you were being repressed or you were repressing other people. So democratic centralism, in its original meaning, which is just plain, any organization is going to try to be both centralized and democratic, or it's not an organization. But it was not a response to underground conditions, but an aspiration for when you could get away. And so the golden age of democratic centralism, in some senses, is 1917, when there could be open party debate, and you weren't fighting a civil war for your survival. Then I would make the argument that the SPD model formed remember, when I say SDP model, I mean a model. I mean not the reality, which is getting messier and messier all the time, but a model, an idealized model that they had in their mind. And they were, of course, disillusioned very much in 1914, and years before and after. But what the Bolsheviks wanted to do was to really do a good job with the do the SPD model correctly. And one thing was, and I haven't talked about this too much, is this split between opportunism and revolutionary, so-called revolutionary social democracy. And what the Bolsheviks decided, and were doing, in so deciding, there were left people all over Europe who agreed with them, and were also saying this: we need a new international that purges the opportunists, a sort of opportunist-free second international, which so the third international, in my view, was not a repudiation of the ideal of the second international. It was an attempt to put it into practice. And so that's one thing, was the third, but of course they did make the big change of trying to purge it of opportunism and sort of often rather messy results from trying to do that. Then finally, and this is the idea of the permanent campaign. Okay, so all that bundle of institutions around the permanent campaign, the press, the clubs, the rallies and everything, they were a way for a party who was a minority, who was harassed, if not out and out repressed, but they were harassed and they were marginalized, and they had to make their presence known. But what would happen if the SPD got control of the government? What happens if they could in a position not to fight for their rights, not to make their presence known on the streets, but to keep everybody else out? And what if that they could then say, as they did that they could have even more impressive demonstrations, even more impressive party press, even more impressive range of institutions? So it's clear that if you look at how the Soviet Union institutions and communist countries in general, it's what I call state monopoly campaignism. You not only does the state put on campaigns, but it realizes, because it has the power to do so, that it can stop anybody else from making campaigns, which sort of helps your campaign because there's no dissenting voice. And then the alternative culture, again, if you start looking at that, you'll see that the SPD model applied without restraint by the state itself turns into what we associate with the Soviet and even Stalinist, in particular, culture of like those, you can picture in your mind the parades of athletes going down the street waving their flags with Stalin on it. So that leads to what I call, finally, the paradox of political freedom, which is this. Before 1917, the most committed, the most revolutionary, the most hardline dogmatic Marxists among the revolutionaries were the biggest fighters for political freedom. After 1917, the most committed, most dogmatic, most revolutionary, most hardline Marxists and revolutionaries were enemies of political freedom, at least in their own country. And oddly enough, Lenin, Volodya Ulyanov, is the poster boy for both these logic. He was someone who was a champion of political freedom in Tsarist Russia, and as we know, did not encourage political freedom afterward. And the part of that paradox is that it's the logic of the SPD model that powers both these ideas. The revolutionaries earlier wanted to have the SPD model, and they needed political freedom for that because they were a small persecuted sect and marginalized movements, and so they fought for political freedom. But then when they got power themselves, have lost the state Soviet power, the same logic of having mass demonstrations, of spreading the message through incessant propaganda, through a wide variety of cultural institutions, of having a unified message that went through all the institutions. This same logic, the logic of the permanent campaign, turned into the opposite of political freedom, because it turned into what we might even call totalitarian, because it implied a complete control over cultural life. Okay, so I'm going to end up rather early, I hope, with going back to the merger formula. Social democracy is the merger of socialism and the worker movement, and I'll suggest that this was not from Marx and Engels' point of view, this was not a recommendation. It was a prediction. It was a prediction that this was going to happen, that the workers were going to see, not in the distant future, but soon, tomorrow, that they were going to see that socialism was their express their final goal, and also that the workers' militant movement would not be satisfied with reforms and improvements in the economic conditions, but realize that to really achieve their own basic interests, they would have to adopt socialism. And the socialists, that is the sort of, what I often call them, the intellectuals, who really believed in this. But I shouldn't say intellectuals, because there were socialists from everywhere. But anyway, the people whose primary motivation was to install socialism would see that they had to work with the mass workers. And so for a while, it looked like, as I said, this was not a recommendation, it was a prediction that this was going to happen. And for a while, it looked exactly what was happening. That was the SPD model, was sort of living proof that this was happening at a mass scale in an advanced industrial country. But say, starting around 1905, a little after that, it became clearer and clearer that these were separating out again, that the merger was falling apart because the trade union leaders were getting less and less interested in socialism, and the socialists were getting more and more exasperated and moving toward that. So what happens when you don't have a merger formula? You have reformism on the one hand and sectarianism on the other. So the real challenge that the history of the SPD and the Bolsheviks is, first, how do you avoid that if you can? You tell me. And secondly, how do you sort of the closest, it just occurred to me now that the closest thing we have now to the SPD model is like the Fox News people. They have a little ecosystem where people here in the States get roiled up in a certain sort of universe of messaging. And how do we if is it possible for us on the good side to use that model, and if we do, to avoid the unpleasant consequences of it and get the good consequences. Okay, so that's all I have to say about plenty more to say, and I'll answer any questions. I'm sorry there were comments going on. I couldn't read them as I was talking.
Yeah, me neither. Thank you very much, Lars. So comrades, if you want to make a comment, please don't just write in the chat, because it's impossible to listen and read that and formulate your answer. So please click raise hand and come in, and a few people have already done so. I'm going to start off by asking you a couple of questions, if that's all right. So I think you explained really well what the Bolsheviks took from the SPD, and you also took apart, I think, some of the images we have of the Bolsheviks, i.e. they were the opposite of the SPD. They were tight, they were small, they were like a conspiracy, conspiratorial organization. They had these professional revolutionaries, which means, you are like, you sleep with your boots on, and you're always, with your gun in your hand, and normal people can't possibly join, etc. I think you're doing, you've done a good job taking that apart. And one question I was going to ask you about the democratic centralism. Again, from my understanding, it is the normal way to organize. It would be now for us the normal way to organize, because we don't mean bureaucratic centralism. We actually mean the widest possible debate. We mean having arguments in the open. We hear minority views in the press, etc. Where do you think this comes from, that democratic centralism is often confused with bureaucratic centralism?
Right. Oh, wow. How do you get confused? Well, my best bet here is that it got at some point to be adopted as a slogan for the part in the early 20s, I think, already. So democratic centralism, by the way, the Mensheviks were the ones who came up with the term in the first place. And, so it's not a Bolshevik thing, particularly. But first of all, it becomes harder and harder to have any kind of thing that looks like genuinely democratic centralism. If you are a state party and you feel like you're a minority, you feel like you're under attack. So after 1918, you couldn't have what you just described. Well, they thought we couldn't have it, and I tend to agree with them that number one, you couldn't afford to show divisions public, and number two, when you had the sort of people had like an army, they're under siege, they had to obey orders. That was more important than getting a long discussion. So that's the first thing. First thing is that because when you become a state party, you have to rethink the method, and it's difficult to figure out how to be a democratically run party while you're a state party, while you're merged with the state. Like the civil service does not have in Western countries you don't want them to be debating policy. You want them to carry it out. So that's one thing. And then I think in the West, also the big communist parties, that partly because of what I said earlier they're going to sort of going to have an opportunist-free set of organizations, and that leads to a certain mentality about sort of suspicion and charges of heresy and this sort of thing. So a lot of the parties ended up being sort of mini personality cults and not very democratic. So I think the idea is great, but it got to be the slogan of something that of the Communist Party. And if you look at the Communist Party, both in the West and the Soviet Union, they didn't look very democratic.
Yeah, no, certainly after 1921 and the ban of factions is certainly a huge change, point of no return. Well, they could have returned, but it did change things quite dramatically once you don't even allow internally discussions, and you demand external democracy, etc. That's not going to work. Political freedom, then, that's an interesting subject. And I hear what you're saying, that they, like the SPD, they had to fight for political democracy, for freedom, etc., because there wasn't any. And, they were the repressed minority, etc. So that when you then, when you become the majority, you don't need it anymore. That could be one way of thinking about it, But isn't also, I mean, as Marxists, from Marx's point of view, democracy, I know we want to abolish democracy, it will wither away under communism, but freedom, it all depends what you mean by these words, of course, but everybody running things, which in my mind is democracy, the widest possible debates, flowering of ideas, everybody, if you don't oppose the order, you can do what you want, more or less, if you don't fight to overturn our communism. But isn't that also, a form of socialism, communism, so that even when you are the majority, or even today when we have so-called democracy, we still have to fight for it, isn't we? We still have to, it's a fight for democracy, for political freedom that goes on for longer than the Bolsheviks probably did. They should have carried on. That might have saved their revolution. How do you see that issue?
Well, I mean, I'm all with you that political freedom is a good thing just for itself, really. I mean, I let 1,000, whatever it is, the flowers bloom. But I'll say two things. First, why it was difficult to keep this commitment. The first is that along with the idea of debate within the party about this and that, the other thing was the idea was the party was there to deliver a message, and the message was like they knew it. It was not to it's a little bit like a church or something like that. You have a doctrine and your message. So you're bringing the socialist message to the workers. It's not something that they're not going to be debating about what socialism is, or basic questions like that. You're delivering a message. And you want people to accept it. So from the beginning, the SPD was, in that sense, not democratic. It was democratic in many other ways. And when the Soviet Union came in, and they were faced with the problems of delivering the message to the workers and the huge illiterate peasantry and all of this other things that I'm sure you're familiar with. They couldn't. I mean, they relied on that tradition of delivering a message, and they applied the logic of it, and so it's continuity with the past too, not just the sort of renunciation of the political freedom tradition, but the continuity with the message delivering side of it, where you knew the truth and you were telling it to the people who didn't know the truth. That's one. And then the other thing is that when you have a revolution, you're surrounded by enemies, and that's part of the deal. So when you're surrounded by enemies, you circle wagons, over the expression is. You don't want dissent in your own ranks. And one reason you don't want dissent in your own ranks is people see that there's a dissent, and they'll try to get in on it, and they'll try to weaken it, and they figure that if anyone within the party starts making appeals to people outside the party for support, this goes back to the faction thing. That's gonna real problems for you if you are. So you have to. Are you ready to allow fascists and or just plain capitalists or anti-Semites, or you get a long list of things where you don't want them to be. They're not free speech absolutists. I mean, most of them certainly weren't in any time. They had to. They didn't want anyone to be delivering counter messages, and they would stop it if they can. And they did that from the word go. So these are real problems. These are real problems. Both of those things. Both their commitments about delivering a message and their situation as a beleaguered armed camp.
Yeah, I mean, we have discussed this question before. Of course, it's sort of when you're there, 1917, and you have the chance to overthrow Tsarism, and you can see, the Germans might do it. They might help us out. They make their revolution, and that could sweep away European, rulers, and it could spark a revolution worldwide, really, or at least in Europe. And they weren't sure, were they? They weren't sure, shall we do it or not? But it kind of happened. And then what do? You run with it, and even then, when the Germans don't do it, what we're going to do? Are we just going to give up and give it back? or are we going to try and stagger on? It's a
Yes,
choice.
and it's not really a choice. You can't go to the peasants and say, "Oh, didn't work out as we expected. Let's give up and let the landowners come back and take your land away." That would be a huge betrayal of of everything, and likely with the workers and everybody else. So you had your commitments, and if it didn't work out, that's I mean, if your expectations didn't work out, you have to live with it.
Yeah. One last question, and before we bring other comrades in with their hands up, Karl Kautsky. Oh, he's a one. I mean, this is an ongoing discussion. I do wonder if you could briefly, his main ideas that we really can still learn from today, and when did he lose the plot?
Yes. Okay. Well, I'm not a real expert on, oddly enough, on Kautsky himself, but I am an expert on what Lenin got from Kautsky. And practically everything I've read by Kautsky is because Lenin pointed me in that direction. And believe me, he had read everything. I quoted they had a party questionnaire for some party congress, 21 or 22, and they said, "Are you familiar with the works of Marx? Which works of Marx, Engels, Liebknecht, and Kautsky are you familiar with?" And he said, "With Marx, Engels, Kautsky, everything." And that's how he answered that, and he did. He was like the supreme Kautsky expert. Maybe Louise Kautsky, his wife, knew better because she read everything. So anyway, so he. I've sort of followed. I picked up from Lenin my idea of Kautsky. So I will say this first. I in my little book, my little biography of Lenin, I sort of divided the three. If I can get this right. How did I do it? The Social Democrat Kautsky. That's what I've been talking about today. The earlier fortune, I called it another one of the book. Then there's the Russian side of this. I'm not getting this right, but yes, that's right. Then there's the Bolshevik side of it, and that's the period from 1905 to 1917. And really, this is where I get controversial, but also pretty well founded with my little footnotes and things. Sort of what I call the new era of war and revolution, when you read what Kautsky was saying. So I'm not saying that Lenin was a Kautskyist. I'm saying that Kautsky was a Leninist. I mean, okay, I exaggerate. But what I'm saying is that Kautsky is more radical than we thought. And Lenin, if Lenin says he agreed with him, it's pretty presumptuous of us who are not the same league as him as a Kautsky expert to say, oh, he was mistaken or something. And then the third thing is the Bolshevik is the communist, and I still think even there are basic ideas that are still listening to Kautsky. One thing, the idea of sort of bringing the peasants in. You can find a lot of that in the book that Kautsky wrote. So Kautsky is a remarkable guy, and we don't personally don't underestimate him, and don't think that Lenin ever changed his mind about Kautsky previous to 1914, say, because I have a long list of comments by Kautsky about Lenin, where he's saying how well Kautsky wrote 60 years ago, or sorry, not 50, 20 years ago, and things like this, when Kautsky entered the market. So what happened was that, from Lenin's point of view and from our point of view, is that that Kautsky got cold feet. He probably got cold feet because it was evident there wasn't going to be a revolution in Germany, and it was not because Kautsky was Kautsky, it was Germany was Germany, and that's my opinion. And but so at a certain point, the Kautsky personally, as you say, lost the plot and became a renegade. But on almost all issues, Lenin didn't repudiate what he said earlier. In fact, and I've been saying this in some of my recent writings, that Lenin went out of his way to say, "I'm not rethinking Marxism. I'm not changing anything. I represent what everybody said beforehand, the revolutionary Marxist, Kautsky, said beforehand, and I'm the one who's consistent, and you're the guys who have changed." So
Thank you.
that's my angle on that.
It's a big issue, isn't it? And that's it's coming back.
The thing is that first of all, I'm going to add one more thing about Kautsky, is that what figure was most influential in erasing Kautsky from our consciousness as a supporter as the Lenin thing? Not Lenin. It's Stalin. It's Stalin and Foundations of Leninism. Pick up that book, which he wrote in 1924, right after Lenin's death, and you'll see that the whole thing is Kautsky and the Second International are irredeemable opportunists, and Lenin was sent on Earth to see through them and to expose them. So I think if you read that book, you will say, who am I closer to on this? Stalin's view of Kautsky or Lenin's view of Kautsky? Which do I feel more comfortable with?
Thank you, comrade. Okay, over now to the audience. If you want to ask a question, make a comment, please click raise hand and we can bring you in. Longer contributions, shorter ones, we take everything. Hello, Pamela.
Hi, everybody. Yeah, so I'm thinking how that, how this discussion applies today when we are facing a trade union bureaucracy, which is very entrenched in reformism. And really, the only leaders of the trade unions were who sort of spoke out against the system in a way, were the RMT leaders like Bob Crow, and who was a Communist Party member or supporter, and Mick Lynch, now of the RMT, he doesn't go there. In the big strikes a couple of years ago, it was vote Labour. So yeah, how do we operate today? Then the other thing was, I think it was about 3 weeks ago that Jack Conrad wrote in the Weekly Worker about having a parliamentary communist majority. And then in today's paper, he says, well, we don't suffer from that incurable reformist malady, parliamentary cretinism. If there was a communist majority in parliament, we would expect a counter-revolutionary storm. So I assume from that he means that in the CPGB, if we stood in elections, we would put forward a communist platform. Yeah, that would be the whole point of standing in Parliament today. What else? I didn't quite catch what Lars was saying in that last bit about Kautsky, the difference between Lenin and Stalin on Kautsky. I mean, was Lenin saying Kautsky was the renegade Kautsky, and was Stalin defending him? And my last question is a comment on Jeff Barr's comment that Lenin and Trotsky tried to fight bureaucracy with bureaucratic means. Yeah, so what does Jeff mean there? And thank you to Matthew for his comment on my comment about the trade union bureaucracy. Thanks.
Thanks, Pamela. Do you want to answer straight away, Lars?
Sure. Let me explain. As far as the trade union, yes. Well, that's the merger formula, as I was saying, it's a sort of trying to avoid that. I mean, avoid the trade union turning into reformists. But the formula itself and the people back then didn't really have any way of, didn't figure out any way of undoing it that they could think of. So as I was saying, there was a profound challenge to the Marxist movement that started up with 1905, 1910. That would have been a real problem, I think, anyway, even without the Russian Revolution and the splits that it caused. Then about the Lenin song. I'm sorry if it's a little confusing, but as I said, Lenin emphasized that he was a Russian representative of international revolutionary social democracy, and that Kautsky had been a spokesman of that, and that Lenin appreciated his role as spokesman of that wing, and still appreciated it. So and Lenin was a renegade. Kautsky was a renegade because he did not live up to his ideals. He at the best he talked the talk, but he didn't walk the walk. Now, but that view of Kautsky as someone who was a great teacher to us Bolsheviks, that's what Lenin said more than once. Kautsky had become the international spokesman of socialist opposition to the Bolsheviks and the Soviet Union. So you couldn't, politically, it's very difficult to say we learned from this guy who turned into our bitter enemy. So Stalin made Lenin and Kautsky enemies from the word go, and said that all Lenin's ideas are new and original with Lenin, and Kautsky said something completely different. And that's not Lenin's view. Lenin's view is that I learned from Kautsky. I'm trying to apply these wonderful revolutionary social democracy commitment, not Kautskyism, that's a lousy word, but Kautsky is a spokesman of revolutionary social democracy, of the revolutionary left-wing tradition in the pre-war Second International. And Stalin had, Republic, personally, I'm sure he knew the truth, but he could not admit, he had to make Kautsky into a devil role, and essentially through this and that and the other thing, and even Trotsky, by the way, also, I have comments and things from 1920, 21 saying, back in the day, Kautsky was a great, would express Bolshevik principles very well, and now he's a renegade. So, I don't know if I made it clear. That's what Stalin was doing, was saying Kautsky was always our enemy, and Lenin never said that, and Setback said the opposite.
Thanks, Lars. Anne, please. You're still muted, comrade.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, thanks. Thanks very much, Lars. That was very interesting. To listen to some of it again, makes, more of a profound effect to me. I'm thinking about it more in terms of what it meant for the organization at the time, the question of political democracy. Now I know, like, that your field is not women's rights under socialism or within the socialist movement, and that that's really my main interest, but you are a Lenin expert. So I just want to make a couple of points. Firstly, interestingly, my main study was of the work of the Zhenotgel in Central Asia. And in their journal, Kommunistka, when they began that work, their articles in 1920 were all about bringing the message of the revolution to the women of the East, all about the news of the revolution. And there's this word, like the direct translation is alarm, but I think it must mean something like the call has gone out, the news has gone out, like anyway, the bell has rung and they've heard the news, and we believe, we hope that they will rise up and meet this announcement and join in our revolution. So I always found that, well, I do find that extremely interesting. After about 1922, you can see that you've gone beyond that phase that existed even in 1920, where they believed that there would be a rising up once people had the news of the revolution. And then that goes and they're kind of more about like solidifying what they've got. And indeed, actually, there was initially a rising up of women in the Soviet East and in the Caucasus. And there were non-party women's conferences, including a planned non-party conference of the women of the East, which was to be held in 1921. And Kollontai was one of the organizers, and also a woman called Samilova, who was one of the old Bolsheviks. Well, she wasn't an old person, but she had been in the party throughout its years in the underground. She joined maybe in 1901, 1902. Anyway, so that's one thing which I thought was interesting. The second thing, though, I don't know if you've ever read R.C. Elwood. He's Ines Armand's biographer. Well, anyway, he doesn't like Lenin, or didn't like Lenin. He's dead now, and he believes that Lenin is like a charlatan. And on women's rights, because obviously his subject is Ines Armand, he describes the correspondence between Ines Armand and Lenin in around 1914, when Ines Armand was writing a book, trying to write a pamphlet on women under socialism, and her she was kind of like focused on the question of women's liberation, and Lenin responded to her, liberation from what? Freedom from what? And he was critical of the idea that she meant freedom in a bourgeois way. So, I mean, that's just really just like a passing thing. But as far as R.C. Elwood was concerned, that Lenin was very instrumental in his approach to the women's question after the revolution as well, wanting women to be brought in to the project simply because it would neutralize them as a potential enemy, and it would, strengthen them. But anyway, that's just one point on that. And then just finally, my last very brief point is, like what you describe is them going out with the good news. This is this is socialism. We're coming to you to give you this news. And then that's a very different phenomenon to them coming to power and having to kind of actualize that good news. So, I think that I'm not sure really how to describe it, but there is certainly a qualitative change takes place. And insofar as political democracy, I think it becomes a different thing after the revolution. And I'm not saying at all that that means that you should restrict it, because you now are in a position of more responsibility than you were before. And I don't have a problem with NEP or whatever they had to do with NEP, but I do have a problem with them deciding to close down political democracy within the party, because I think that even if they had to make a decision about what to do, and they did have the majority with them, that they shouldn't have silenced their critics. Anyway, that's all. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Anne. Do you have anything to reply to that, Lars?
Well, I do know Carter Elwood. I met him before he retired a few years ago, and very nice gentleman. And I should say that you said he didn't like Lenin, and you're right, politically he didn't. But he wrote a series of rather charming essays, like on what Lenin ate, what Lenin went on vacation, what Lenin sort of athletics, and they're very much worth reading and a lot of fun. And so I sort of salute him for being able to get past his political prejudices and write those essays. But I will say just one little thing, and you sort of said that Lenin was instrumental with the cultural interesting. these are complicated questions about how not just women, but all sorts of reform movements, about how to roll them into the general socialist project. And the basic idea was that socialism is going to solve all the problems, and you don't want to have sort of separatism. And there was also there was a bourgeois, worker women's movement that this problem is still with us today, or whether it meets feminism and all that stuff. So they have to think of ways of bringing the women in and John Gel and so forth. And it's perfectly, what you were saying about the Central Asia and everything. It's all very true when you can back and forth. But I don't think it's kind of fair to say he, Lenin, or any of them were instrumentalists in their thinking about this.
Thank you, Lars. Peter Kennedy, please.
Hi, Lars. Can you hear me? Yeah?
Yeah.
Hi there. I've just got two questions. It was an interesting discussion, and I haven't read all your books and all that, but I've kind of, it's come to light that you've written a lot around Bolshevism, social democracy, and so on. So that's got me interested. And I know, if I got this right, that you're trying to overcome like the simple binaries between social democracy, the German SPD, and as that developed in Germany, and then as that was transplanted somewhat in Russia prior to the revolution, and developed within the Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks and so on, and how that makes it kind of complex as to the kind of political organization that is suitable for a radical democracy, but based on workers taking power, socialism. And I think that's what, I've only, just said it that way, but you say it much more complex. But I'm hoping that's in the right direction of what you're trying to achieve. So it kind of, yourself, and I wrote this in the chat and you can see it there, but you're a historical researcher. I'm presuming now that you're doing it because you're also have got skin in the game, as it were. You're interested in the present, and the best history usually has a present mind and this about it, and so I think that's the case. But also the best of history, as is located in the context of, in this case, capitalist political economy. So I've got two questions, and I don't know whether they're fair in this kind of environment or not. It's quite broad ones. So what is your understanding of the present nature of capitalist political economy, just very roughly? And on the basis of this, what's your view on what political organizational form is best for achieving working class power to achieve socialism?
Wow.
So you may not be able to answer the first one, I don't know, but you must have an angle on, what you would like to see working class organizational forms come into being, which can challenge capitalism no matter what it is, its nature is right now, in your opinion. So as I say, you might have done that and you read in your books that but I haven't read any of that. But I would like to know, in the present, what does it all mean?
I can't answer this question because I'm not sure. I genuinely do not know how to get from where we are to a better place.
Lars, could you sit a bit closer to your microphone? It's a bit.
Sorry. Yeah, I'm moving back.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
tell me if I would do that. So, so I'm going to have to pass on that because not only it's not my competence as an expert or anything, but I genuinely don't know how to do it. I would say two lessons, possible lessons from the past. The sort of one is this idea of sort of what I would call a democratic revolution to the end. That was the phrase they used, do Końca. And so what they were saying in 1905, the Bolsheviks in particular, was that we need a way of getting democratic revolution to the end to get the best possible way out of this revolution that's going on. It's not going to go socialist in 1905, but we wanted to go democratic all the way to the end. So I think that kind of thinking can be applied to today, to saying what we socialists want is to carry out. I'm sort of thinking, first of all, the United States, the revolution was never carried out to the end, the Civil War and Reconstruction and so forth. So why not make that our slogan, to carry it out to the end, and then have the opportunity, and then we have allies, but we keep our sorry, and that's one thing. The other thing is one thing it's about campaignism is sort of focuses you on how to get the message across, and then but media and all this sort of thing, and what a book on this topic was called, it has the great name title of Demonstration Culture, and it was sort of invented in and around this time. And the socialists were generally invented it. The rallies of passing out the papers, of passing out petitions, and the American Party was still kind of using that same toolbox to a large extent, aren't they? You tell me. But so I think a more sophisticated, I'm not the one to do it, I'm an old guy, but a more sophisticated approach to new media, new communications, new ways of handling it would be great, and get away from looking like some guy in 1920 is handing out leaflets standing on the corner. Can we get beyond that? Those are pretty minor, I guess, in the grand scheme of things, but those are things that I think that my own application of what I learned to today.
Thank you. Liam, please.
Hi, Lars. Thank you so much. So this is just a question on a kind of pet project that I'm working on. But in What Is to Be Done and in the sort of 1902 Iskra era, Lenin and Zasulich, they separate the SDP model of fighting for political freedom from the strategy of individual terrorism carried out by the socialist revolutionaries. And I'm kind of interested in that nowadays with the case of Luigi Mangione and that kind of thing. My question is to what extent do you think that the terrorism campaigns of the SRs actually helped the Bolsheviks, especially when they separated from the Mensheviks and took a path of active revolution against a sort of passive waiting for the time to come? And do you think that Lenin holds to the primacy of propaganda in 1917 in the same way that he does in 1902? And essentially just ask what your opinions on that question.
Thanks, Liam. Interesting question. Lars.
Thank you.
Okay. That's an interesting, well, I hadn't quite put it that way, of the terrorism of today, Mangione and everything. So, okay. Yes, indeed, you're absolutely right. That was the whole party was a great campaign against terrorism, and you can find some of the articles in Lenin's complete work. It's easy enough to find them, and there were other articles, and they were against it not for moral reasons. These guys are oppressive. I mean, when they were talking about terrorism, they weren't talking about blowing up a cafe of innocent people. They were talking about targeting czarist villains of some kind or another. So targeted assassinations, I guess we call them today. But they had nothing against what they called mass terrorism, and what they meant by that was not we're going to terrorize the masses, which is kind of how it turned out in some ways, but that the masses would apply the terrorism, i.e., they would. So I don't know exactly what they meant by it, but they would hang the mob would hang up a minister from a minister from a lamp pole. But in 1917, everybody they tried to not have that kind of physical repression, and I don't think they wanted to do that. I don't think they were looking forward to doing that, but they were ready to do it if necessary, and boy, was it, in their eyes anyway, necessary. Now, as far as propaganda and delivering the message, in 1917, Lenin was totally committed to that still. And my big thing about what I'm saying about Lenin in 1917 was he came back and he, we say with the April thesis, he wanted to speed things up. Everybody was being sort of right wing and semi-Menshevik and so forth. But Lenin's own view of this, when he was looking back, was I slowed things down in April. I slowed things down because there were people who were trying to jump the gun, who were trying to get ahead of themselves and have a armed uprising before there was support for it. We got to get the support first, and I'm sure we will get it very fast because we have we're right, and events will prove us right. And they got it faster than we expected, only 8 months. So that's with Lenin, who was, I think, genuinely committed, and why shouldn't he be? It's not to getting mass support that he realized he did not have in April, and he was going to get it. And so, rolling around September and October, he said, "Now we have the support, but let's go to the next step. Let's bring this relationship to a higher level." So that's what I would say about Lenin in 1970.
Thanks, Lars. Ian, please.
Hi, thanks. I thought the discussion of movementism was very interesting, but slightly unfair to Lenin to basically say became an opponent of political freedom as soon as he got into power. It sort of reminded me of the Erdogan saying democracy is a train that we take to our destination and then get off. And despite obviously a lot of repression under Lenin's own leadership, all of that time was pretty much time of civil war, foreign intervention, and so on, plus the very rapid revolutionary situation and hopes post-World War I in the wider world, because they were never wanting to go it alone. And that by 1922, unfortunately on his deathbed, what do you think of Lenin's last struggle, so-called, where he did seem to be trying to democratize again, to counter bureaucracy in the party and the society, to revitalize the Soviets? I saw a whole talk by Professor Richard Wolff talking about him advocating democracy at work in those times, and preaching with Stalin over the national question, and actually moving faster than Trotsky, who let him down in the spring of 1923 in terms of putting an oppositional kind of platform for more democracy. And then obviously he died, and the rest is history. But the idea that he was definitely going in a certain direction once it was peacetime and there was encirclement, but it was things had calmed down from constant crisis of war, famine, intervention. I just, I thought that was a little bit broad brush, and that maybe that kind of Cold War view of Lenin's a bit simplistic. So just wondered what you thought of that, Lenin's last struggle. And just one last thing in terms of Lenin and Kautsky's relationship, it just occurred to me when you were discussing it with Tina, maybe a bit of a provocation, that it sort of reminded me of George Galloway's famous phrase to Christopher Hitchens about a butterfly metamorphosizing into a slug. And I agree with the old anti-war Kautsky rather than the new pro-war. See, it was even over the same kind of issue that they fell out. So that's maybe a bit of a provocation. I wonder what folk think of that.
Thanks, Ian.
Okay, well, yeah, it's a fraught topic, Lenin and political freedom. But first of all, yes, they did clamp down, and I'm among those who are willing to make more excuses for him. I mean, him, both things in general. I just don't quite see the possibility of political freedom for. I mean, there was no. You don't win civil wars and you don't win split societies by any other method. But there was pretty complete. That's the thing that's strange. By the time of 1920, 21, there was nothing outside. There was no civil society anymore. There was no independent organization, and that's the new thing and the unsettling thing. And then, as far as Lenin's Last Struggle, that's the name of a book by Moshe Lewin, classic book. Well, I have I've written on this. One of my early articles was on Lenin's Testament, and I could refer you to that. It's reprinted in my new book, What Was Bolshevism? I could do a plug for it here. New book, What Was Bolshevism? Got a lot of good essays on especially after Bolshevism after 1917, mainly through the 30s. HM. But first of all, it was only the party. It wasn't, in fact, the idea of political freedom for, for capitalists or other socialist parties or anything like that was not in spirit. And secondly, I'm on record as sort of saying that even his what he was saying was not very democratic. It was sort of I want to liven up things, but I need to get the experts, and I want to have he wanted to keep the lid on, and I can see why he wanted it. I mean, it was important, but he didn't square the circle, and I was sort of side with those that I'm not super impressed with the cogency of his solutions to the problem. He saw the problem. He saw the problem for years. But in 1920, we can already see him worrying about this. Bureaucracy, party, lack of this, lack of that. But he didn't find a way of squaring the circle, which is to have both the fuel and a healthy democratic culture.
Thank you. Ant, please.
Hiya, am I there?
Yep.
Okay. I think Peter asked the correct question. Why are we looking at all this? What can we learn from this, and how can we apply it to today? And I think the reality is that many of the lessons are negative. A lot, obviously, I've wrote certain things down throughout this, so this is going to be a bit rambling, but I'll do my best to make it coherent. One of the things that I think Lars said. He talked about the ideal of the Second International. I think that's a good quote. I think he said that, and I think right at the beginning he talked about the task of the party to prepare the class. But I'm going to say that the SDP just wasn't up to it. I think that one of the main planks was as you said yourself, the fight for political democracy, freedom. But it could not see that there is bourgeois democracy and proletarian democracy. And I think when it actually came to the crunch, when it came to the actual revolution, then the SDP was incapable of breaking with ideas of bourgeois democracy. The SDP, I said the ideal of the Second International, but the whole thing was full of contradictions. There wasn't a single ideal. I think this all came to light eventually, didn't it? The right wing of the SDP, ordered the murder of the left wing. It was they actually made a phone call to Nosk, who said yes, kill Rosa Luxemburg, and she was killed. Yeah, so you're talking about the ideals of the Second International. So one of the ideals was get rid of the left wing, the revolutionaries, and obviously there was a centre, and I think that the centre was expressed by the USPD, the Independent Social Democratic Party, and that was led by Kautsky and Bernstein. and essentially their position was pacifism. And obviously, that there was an authentic revolutionary left wing, and I think that we'll that was led by Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht. But even Luxemburg could not bring herself to break with the SPD until the very, very, very last moment. Sort of like a month before the January uprising, which obviously failed. And Rosa said, when she eventually decided not to commit suicide due to the voting for war credits, she eventually recovered somewhat, and she said, well, better the worst working class party than none at all, which sort of like sums up Rosa in a way. It's she could not see that there was a need for a crystal clear revolutionary party. One of the things that Rosa Luxemburg said is the fact is that the social democracy is not joined to the organization of the proletariat. It is itself the proletariat. That's quoted from Rosa Luxemburg Speaks. But that's not true. That's not true. The revolutionary party is the conscious minority. I think Lenin, understood this. Lenin understood that the working class consciousness under capitalism was necessarily limited. Now, we can argue all day about exactly what level of class consciousness the working class can attain under capitalism, and obviously just as we are here now speaking in the most revolutionary terms, yes, it does exist. Class consciousness does exist in the working class under capitalism, but it's still a minority of the working class who can attain revolutionary class consciousness. But the real answer to what Peter was asking, and I was surprised that Lars couldn't say this. The real answer to all of this. I'm going to quote you. It's just I don't know if you can see this book, Russia, Revolution and Counter-Revolution, written by my friend Jacques Domini, who was a local history teacher. I'm just going to read you it's about 2 lines really. The answer. An international political body fighting for the communist program. That is, all the acquisitions of all previous workers' struggles, including the ones detailed in this study, and a whole series of class-wide bodies through which the workers can reshape society, are necessary conditions for the future triumph of socialism. So all this idea, and I'm going to read it. I'm going to read it. So I posted it in the comments. Yes, I posted it in the comments. That in Weekly Worker, I'm quoting now, of course, we are what Marx called extreme Democrats. We positively advocate the dictatorship, the decisive rule of the working class through winning a thumping communist majority in the House of Commons. Yeah, no, that's not written, decades ago by Karl Kautsky. That's written now by the Communist Party of Great Britain. Yes, so all of this is simply repeating. Yes, the mass of the class does not become or does not attain revolutionary class consciousness under capitalism. Yes, only a minority does, and that minority can extend its influence to the mass through the arising or the creation of mass organs of participation in a revolutionary situation, and not outside of that. Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, just on that, I mean, Lars is not a member of the Communist Party of Great Britain or the Weekly Worker, and you're quoting out of context. So, but do you have anything to say on this, Lars?
Yeah, well, a couple of things, just a couple. The SPD wasn't up to the task. Well, of course, it wasn't up to the task, but that doesn't mean that the task was doable if someone had the correct line of this and that. I don't think so. maybe the task was too much for it or anybody else. They'd had a mass party based on social ideals. You haven't seen the like of it since. And then the ideals of the Second International were to kill off Rosa and Karl Liebknecht. And okay, we're semantics because when Lenin said that the German left wing, pre-war left wing, was the model that we should all live up to. It's the closest thing to the best we can have. So that's the ideology he was talking about. Not he rejected the opportunism, and so that wasn't his Second International. He tried to get what he wanted to do was have a third international that would be the best of the Second International, the left wing of it, minus the opportunism which he felt was tolerable before the war, but no longer tolerable. And I quoted occasionally, put side by side, Lenin in the 2020 book about left-wing communism and Lassalle about the permanent campaign. And the quotes are practically identical. Go out there, ring the doorbells, never unflagging energy in sending the message, using parliamentary elections to spread the message and so forth. And then finally, whether the answer is the solution isn't a mass party based on that's what you want, but how do you get that? That's not a solution. That's what you need to get. How do you get that? And it's a very, very difficult problem to merge the worker movement and socialism. It can't be done by just saying, "Oh, it's a good idea."
Thank you. I think Jeff has a question along those lines, actually.
Yeah, right. I think the value of Ant is it expresses wrong-headed ideas more clearly than anyone else. First of all, democracy. Bourgeois democracy is not democracy. I've looked at it in Britain, and essentially what happens is that you have a liberal capitalist regime which introduces a certain level of democratic rights. In the United States, you have a democratic component in a non-democratic system. The House of Representatives was the democratic component. The Senate, the presidency, etc. were not. The presidency was deliberately elected through the Electoral College to make sure that the riffraff didn't win. That was the point of the indirect mode of election. We mean something quite different by democracy. That is, that the majority runs the show. It is a qualitatively different approach. Secondly, this question that Ant put so crudely, that essentially the working class are a load of ignorant plebs and they need to be taught from the outside by incredibly boring newspapers. Absolutely upside down. The working class is the force that develops socialism, as Marx pointed out very early in his political career. It is not something that develops outside the working class. It flows from the logic of the working class's web of social relationships. So that in that sense, Kautsky got it upside down. And of course, Lenin, in What Is to Be Done, took over. The core of What Is to Be Done is a quotation from Kautsky, making this very point that for him, socialism comes to the working class from the outside. It is upside down. That is the key point. And what they did was develop an ideology of Marxism rather than using Marx as an open way of understanding the world. So it's qualitatively different. Ant says the task of the party is to prepare the class. I'd say the task of the class is to prepare the party. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Jeff. I've got no one else with their hand up, so I suggest, Lars, perhaps you could use this to also sum up the session?
Okay, well, let me go through the from outside issue. And so first of all, back in 1840s, socialism was in fact kind of an intellectual thing, and that's just a fact, you know. I mean, and to say that Marx thought that, I mean, there were socialists who were workers, sure, like well, the name is escaping me, but you know, there were genuine worker socialists, and there were intellectual socialists. And so it's not like it's outside the class; it's just outside the worker movement, and it was developed in a different historical context with different ideas. Like people like Owens and Fourier and all that sort of stuff. So, what Marx's idea was that they would bring it with, they would merge it with the workers' movement, and it goes both ways. The worker movement is also outside socialism and has to be brought to it. So the job of the communists is to bring these two together, these two living, historically real movements, to merge them. And they felt that the communists, you know, I'm using a word now for Marx and Engels and his friends in the 1840s, was to, there they were, and they wanted them to, their big idea was to bring them together, that they were separate. And for 3 generations, it looked like this might happen. My pessimistic feeling is that somewhere along 1905, the merger stopped looking like it was going forward, and we had never really figured out a way of getting it back on track again. And if I had a solution for it, I'd tell you. I don't see anything undemocratic or anti-worker or anything about Kautsky's formulation. I think he had Marx right. I think Lenin had Kautsky right, and had Marx right. What is it I used to say, that people disagree with me about my view of Lenin's view of Kautsky's view of Marx, but so that's that. It's the merger formula, which I find rather an inspiring ideal, and I don't think it's insulting to the workers, and it's not insulting to the socialists, or equally insulting to both. They're isolated. If they're isolated, they're sectarians and reformism that do good in the world, I guess, but it isn't going to be the great historical mission. And then to sum up, I guess, I just see, in some sense, what I have tried to go over is a lot of dilemmas, a lot of paradoxes, a lot of inspiring ideals that didn't quite work out, but we can still be inspired by. I'm sure there's always a temptation to say, well, if I'd been there and I would have understood Marx better, it would have been, you know, we would have had a revolution in Germany and everything would have been fine. But I'm more determinist, and you find that it's not really a matter of people not understanding what was going on. They tried their best and it didn't work. And the problems that they didn't realize came up, no one realized them. And so we can look at the problems and try to learn from them, but I don't think we should be condescending and sort of schoolmasters about them. You know, like, if you'd only done this, if you'd only read Marx more carefully, you would have succeeded. So that's sort of my perspective.
Thank you very much, Lars. I also find the idea of a merger formula quite interesting and quite inspiring. I mean, for me, it basically says, you know, there's the working class. Unfortunately, it will rebel. Of course, not unfortunately. The working class rebels against its terrible conditions. It always will. It always has. But to get to socialism, to understand there's an alternative we have to build, you know, that will not arise spontaneously out of the economic struggle. It will not come, you know, you don't go on strike and then you sort of think, oh yeah, communism, that's the idea. You know, everybody would have to think of that spontaneously by themselves. So, you know, there is a party that's thinking about this kind of stuff. And the idea is, of course, not to bring it from the top. You know, that sounds like a sect, you know, you lot are stupid and we're going to put it on top of you as a sect. No, it comes from the outside in that, you bring it together, you fertilize each other as well in a way, but it's not in that sort of sectarian way that it's often perceived, that the clever people are going to bring it to the stupid people or anything like that. You need both, to actually move forward together and to get to anything close to a socialist, a revolution, a socialism, a transition to communism. And that's exactly what we're going to talk about next week. Smooth transition there. Moshe Machova and Mike McNair will be discussing collective decision-making in the transition to communism. No easy subject at all. It does touch on a lot of issues we've been discussing in the last few weeks. How do we avoid, a dictatorship taking hold? How do we deal with people who have different ideas who want to restore capitalism? How do we deal with opponents in our own groups, etc., etc.? So these are really important discussions that I'm sure we're not going to solve next week either, but we certainly are going to have a good discussion about it. Thank you very much, Lars. I will put out links to all your books when I'm sending out the links to the video, and anything specific you want to send it to me, and I'll forward it. Thank you very much, comrades. Thank you, Lars. Good night.
Thanks for the questions.
Jake, you'll need to stop the webinar.